If it's Wednesday, House Republicans launch a second impeachment inquiry, this time into President Biden's Homeland Security chief, as party leaders and presidential candidates seize on the record-breaking influx of migrants at the southern border. Plus, Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy's provocative comments on white supremacy, as NBC News and the Des Moines Register kick off a series of special interviews with the candidates making their closing arguments in Iowa. And rising tensions in the Middle East as Biden administration officials speak out, saying neither the U.S. nor Israel was behind a pair of explosions that killed nearly 100 people in Iran. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Gabe Gutierrez in Washington, and we begin today at the U.S. southern border as the Biden administration comes under fire again for its handling of the migrant crisis, and as Republicans move to spotlight the issue politically with another impeachment inquiry. Moments ago, House Speaker Mike Johnson held a press conference while leading a delegation of roughly 60 House Republicans to Eagle Pass, Texas. He lashed out at the Biden administration and demanded the White House take stronger action.
Since the time that President Biden took office, the administration has done next to nothing to protect the border, but we've all seen with our own eyes, they have opened the border wide to the entire world. The president can and should act now. This doesn't require legislation. It requires leadership. And despite the White House's claim, he has all the authority he needs right now under existing federal law to stop this madness.
It comes as a committee spokesperson confirmed to NBC News the House Homeland Security Committee will formally begin impeachment proceedings against Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. This morning, Mayorkas telling MSNBC he will cooperate with the inquiry. The first hearing has been scheduled for 1 week from today. Meanwhile, border officials are scrambling to address a record-breaking number of encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border, which shut down 4 major ports of entry for much of December. DHS officials tell NBC News border apprehensions are down to start the year, and the administration is now planning to reopen those ports of entry this week. On the campaign trail, Republicans are seizing on the issue, with presidential candidates Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis both out with separate op-eds today, blaming the migrant influx squarely on President Biden. The Biden administration is responding, with Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas accusing Texas's Republican governor of playing politics with the issue, as Texas officials continue to bus and fly asylum seekers to democratically controlled states and cities.
The fact that we have one governor in the state of Texas who is refusing to cooperate with other governors and other local officials and coordinate efforts to address a challenge that our country, which this country should stand united to address, that our country is facing. And it's a remarkable failure of governance to refuse to cooperate with one's fellow local and state officials.
Adding even more urgency to the situation at the border are talks here in Washington. Senate negotiators are back at it, trying to strike a deal on border security legislation, which the White House has tied to a number of other U.S. national security priorities, including aid to Israel and Ukraine. NBC's Morgan Chesky filed this report from the border in Texas.
Yeah, good afternoon. We're here in Eagle Pass, and oh, what a difference just a few weeks can make. We were here witnessing the thousands of migrants that waited beneath the Eagle Pass bridge to be processed by Customs and Border Protection, waiting hours, if not days in certain cases. But today, the sunshine is out. The river is being patrolled by numerous boats, and as of last check, there has not been a significant number of migrants that have come across. Federal officials saying that on Monday alone, a mere 500 migrants were spotted crossing this entire sector. You put that against some of the averages we saw in December when there was a daily average of upwards of 10,000, and you can understand the kind of dip that we're seeing. Now, important as that is to acknowledge, it's also important that authorities say that this could wildly fluctuate based upon what's happening on the other side of the border. They say that Mexican officials have cracked down with law enforcement on migrant movements there, but as of right now, they're not publicly sharing how they're doing so. We also know that there is a seasonal dip that's anticipated around the holidays this time of year. All that to say that people here are appreciating this temporary lull, but make no mistake, everyone understands it is absolutely temporary.
And our thanks to Morgan Chesky for that reporting. Now we're joined by NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley and NBC News senior national political reporter Sahil Kapoor has the latest from Capitol Hill. And Julia, I want to start with you. Let's break these numbers down a little bit. They were obviously record-breaking last month. Now we're looking at one day, numbers are down. Tell us what's behind this and why is the Biden administration touting these numbers so quickly?
Well, Morgan's right. Of course, the numbers do tend to go down this time of year. A lot of people don't want to start that trek right around the holidays. And so what you're seeing now is the dip that started probably right before Christmas. Cartels also have to go back and get more migrants, build up resources because they pushed so many people through in December. But according to the seasonal data, we'll probably be at another record in early March if you look at how these things have gone and the fact that we've been at such big highs. The one piece of good news that might actually stick is the fact that the border processing centers are now able to breathe a sigh of relief. Border processing centers where Morgan is were at 3 times their capacity before Christmas. Now they're at 30% of their capacity.
And we mentioned that the administration is now reopening those 4 ports of entry. Talk to me about that and what impact will that reopening have?
I think the biggest thing that we can dispel for people on that is that doesn't mean to let in more migrants. That means to allow people who are traveling for commercial reasons or for trade to come through cargo lines every day. They used to take the officers from those checkpoints and put them out in the field to apprehend migrants who are crossing illegally. But because of these lower numbers, they're now able to open that. So it's better for trade. It's better for people who might live on one side of the border, go to school on the other side. I talked to a lot of people in Lukeville, Arizona, just a couple of weeks ago who thought they were going to have to close their businesses if that didn't reopen soon.
And those pictures from your reporting in Lukeville were just incredible, that huge number of migrants that were there. Look, the Biden administration has been asked, and I remember, I've asked them repeatedly about this, but there's been a lot of backlash from big city mayors across the country. Even today, we just learned that Denver, for example, plans to spend up to 10% of its budget this year to pay for migrants. But what is the administration saying now? I know there's been a lot of controversy about busing some of these migrants now to the suburbs. What is the Biden administration saying?
Well, the Biden administration is saying that they want to give these cities best practices. You know, they visited cities like Denver, like New York. They want to be in Chicago. They've tried to meet with their officials there and try to tell them, look, you want to get as many of these immigrants working as possible. So if they're eligible for asylum, as any Venezuelan who came in this summer can now apply, they want to open those clinics, get that going. But really, they need more money from Congress. So they're putting this back again on Congress in order to help cities like Denver, who were not budgeted for this. It could cost them $100 million this year. They only had $20 million in their rainy day fund. Those people are really worried. Yeah, that's right. The Biden administration has said repeatedly that it has given these cities some money. It's part of the supplemental request, but these local officials repeatedly say it's just not enough. Now, before I let you go, Julia, I want to ask you, we heard that, today, now Secretary Mayorkas is now be facing this impeachment inquiry. How's he preparing for that? And I also want to correct, I don't think they've gone to Denver, but they have been in touch with the mayor there. Let me correct myself there. But yeah, so Mayorkas is going to the border. He's going right here to Eagle Pass on Monday. And then on Wednesday, he'll start, as the first impeachment inquiries get underway. We should point out that 8 Republicans actually switched sides to vote against an impeachment inquiry. This could have happened much more quickly against impeachment in a floor vote in November, but instead they referred it back to the House Committee on Homeland Security, and they'll start that impeachment inquiry because they want to be able to bring out a lot of dirt to try to show that Mayorkas hasn't been doing his job and that everything that's going on at the border is the fault of one man. I think they might have a hard time proving that. And one thing that DHS continues to say is this takes a lot of work because they want so many documents. They want so much time. It's taking time and manpower away from people who can be coming up with solutions. And Mayorkas himself is deeply involved in these negotiations. Exactly. He's over on Capitol Hill involved in, discussing
discussing logistics with these Senate negotiations. Julia Ainsley, thank you so much for joining here on set. I want to turn now to Sahil Kapoor, our Capitol Hill correspondent. And Sahil, let's take a little bit closer look at the logistics for this Mayorkas impeachment, which we were just talking about with Julia. What can you tell us about the House proceedings against Mayorkas, and what do we expect that to look like exactly?
Well, Gabe, what we know is that the House Homeland Security Committee will officially begin its impeachment proceedings on Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas next week, January 10th. It's a week from today. The first hearing will be titled, quote, "Havoc in the Heartland, How Secretary Mayorkas's failed leadership has impacted the states," unquote. The premise of this is they're accusing him of failing, refusing, pick your word, to enforce immigration laws and essentially creating, in their view, this chaos at the border. At the end of the day, this is going to require a vote of the full House of Representatives to actually impeach him if they decide to go down that road. And that Republican majority is about to shrink even further. Another retirement is expected later this month. Speaker Mike Johnson will only have 2 votes to play with as opposed to 3. So there's a long way to go. There's no timeline beyond this first hearing. This is something that members like Marjorie Taylor Greene have been clamoring for a long time. It looks like she's going to get her way, at least to kick this off.
Havoc in the heartland. That's quite an election year slogan. So, Sahil, is Mayorkas, he's saying he's going to cooperate, but does he really have a choice here?
Not exactly. They don't need his cooperation if they want to move to impeach him. He doesn't get a vote in that matter, but he could try to cooperate, of course, and make his case and try to undermine their argument. Remember, it's going to require pretty much all Republicans to vote to impeach him, and some of them are from swing districts, competitive districts, where maybe some swing voters won't look kindly upon an impeachment that appears to them to be political.
And Sahil, we just saw House Speaker Mike Johnson down at the border. He's there with 60 other Republicans. Take us inside that visit and what's behind it.
Yeah, that's right. Speaker Mike Johnson and dozens of Republicans going to Eagle Pass, Texas. Those are the images you see on the screen there. They've been talking to reporters over the last half hour or so. This is a city along the U.S.-Mexico border that they're trying to turn into a symbol of this crisis of migrants coming in that the U.S. is not quite able to handle and process. Johnson is accusing the Biden administration of a dereliction of duty, failing to use the tools at his disposal to crack down on migration and deter new arrivals. The Biden administration take and Mayorkas' take on this is simply Congress needs to give them more money to enforce the laws that Congress is required to. They say they need funding for Border Patrol agents, more asylum officers, more immigration judges, and more technologies to catch fentanyl. That's the way they see being able to enforce the laws on the books, and that's part of the president's Homeland Security package. Republicans say you don't get a dime in new money, even for the border, unless you agree to tougher asylum laws.
And Sahil, let's drill down on that before I let you go. As we were talking about, Julia, Secretary Mayorkas is on the Hill as those Senate negotiations resume in the new year. Do we have any details about the state of those talks?
The details are very quiet. The Senate negotiators are holding their cards close to the vest here. We know that the 3 of them, the bipartisan negotiators in the Senate, were joined by Mayorkas yesterday in a meeting on the Hill. He said he was simply there to provide technical advice and explain to them, if you do this, if you do that, here's how we would implement it, here's what would work and what wouldn't. Senator Chuck Schumer sounded optimistic about the direction of these talks, even though they don't have a deal. Let's play what Schumer had to say.
We're making progress. We're closer than we have been. But this is a very difficult issue, and there are still different things, different issues to be overcome with. It's very nice that they have a trip to the border, but the only way to solve this is here, working in a bipartisan way with Senate Republicans, Senate Democrats, and House Democrats to get it done, period.
And the important caveat I'll add, Gabe, is that even if the Senate comes to a deal and passes it with the necessary 60 votes to break a filibuster, it still has to get through the Republican-controlled House. And Speaker Mike Johnson, in those images you just played, told reporters that what he wants is the more far-reaching so-called H.R. 2 bill, the more aggressive border bill that is dead on arrival in the Senate, according to Democratic leaders.
Looks like a long road ahead. Sahil Kapoor, live for us on Capitol Hill. Sahil, thank you. And coming up, closing arguments, Iowa. Vivek Ramaswamy sits down with NBC News for a wide-ranging interview covering Trump, conspiracy theories, white supremacy, and more. We'll have the key highlights 12 days out from the first-in-the-nation caucuses. Next. Plus, on high alert, we're following the fallout from multiple bomb threats against multiple state capitals today, and what the incidents mean for security concerns nationwide in an election year. You're watching Meet the Press Now. And welcome back. It is crunch time in Iowa with less than 2 weeks until the Republican caucus. NBC News and the Des Moines Register are jointly interviewing some of the top GOP presidential candidates as they make their closing arguments in the Hawkeye state. Ahead of 5 campaign stops today, Vivek Ramaswamy sat down for a wide-ranging interview with my NBC colleague Dasha Burns and the Des Moines Register's Brianne Fanninsteel. They asked Ramaswamy about his new endorsement from controversial former Iowa Republican Congressman Steve King, who was removed from his committees and voted out of Congress after embracing some white supremacist ideology. Ramaswamy defended King while being pressed to explain his own views on the issue of white supremacy. Take a listen.
Steve King was stripped of his committee assignments in 2019. You mentioned the New York Times. He was quoted as saying white nationalist, white supremacist, Western civilization. How did that language become offensive? Do you agree with those comments?
Well, I think that I take Steve King's words over the New York Times, that he didn't say those things. And I've had my own experiences with the media, and I understand that if Steve King, who I've gotten to know, and I really believe that this is an honest man and a patriot who cares about speaking the truth, versus some New York Times reporter who hasn't offered a shred of evidence that he said such a thing. First of all, let's start with that. I don't even think those are the facts. I think there's something deeper, though. And I actually was looking at this because someone sent this to me last night after a lot of the backlash relating to the Steve King endorsement. They sent a whole New York Times compilation of all the racist things he said, supposedly racist things he said. Well, actually, some of them are just calling for basic border security in the United States, calling for English as the national language in the United States, pointing out the criminality of many people who have come to this country illegally. A lot of that isn't racist at all. People asked me even last night, will you denounce white supremacy? We live in a moment where, don't forget, a lot of the left has defined white supremacy to include things like punctuality or the written word. This is just as of a couple of years ago. Even many in the DEI Academy, in academia and otherwise, have said concepts like this are vestiges of white supremacy. These words have ceased to mean anything. And so if somebody wants to define white supremacy for me, then we can actually have a serious conversation about it. But until then, I think a lot of this is actually a charade. I think Steve King was defeated in part because of a donor establishment that used a toxic influence on money in politics to be able to disfavor him. But this is somebody who I believe is a patriot. I'm proud to have his endorsement. I'm not afraid to say it, and I think that that's what makes me different than a lot of the other candidates.
Let's talk about white supremacy and what happened last night for a moment, because when you were talking to reporters last night, you called white supremacy a myth. When someone asked you about Dylan Roof, you said you didn't know who that is. Have you looked up what happened in 2015?
Yeah, look, I said this last night. Invidious racial discrimination is wrong no matter how it happens. But if a Washington Post reporter is asking me almost like a catechism, whatever question I said, I'm against invidious racial discrimination, whatever form it takes, but says, do you denounce white supremacy? It's incumbent on us for us to define what white supremacy is. I wrote my book, Woke Inc., and I've written about the detailed understanding of what the popular understanding of these terms have come to mean. Do you believe punctuality is a vestige of white supremacy, Dasha?
Look,
because if you don't, then you have a disagreement about many of the people who are defining those terms, or the written word, or the use, or the nuclear family. These aren't my words. These are the words of intellectual proponents from Ibram Kendi to the Ayanna Presleys to BLM that have said these are vestiges of white supracy. So
Mr. Ramaswamy,
we can't have it both ways.
What you do, though.
We have to have an honest discussion.
Straw man arguments.
Last night
you brought up Jussie Smollett as the best example of white
Smollett was the hottest thing in news in the back of a fake actual attack on him that we have to contend with.
And yet you have examples like the Buffalo shooter in New York just in 2022.
You have other examples.
But you are also cherry picking when you bring up Jussie Smollett.
I'll look at all of the statistics. More black on black crime. If you really care about actual crime against black Americans, let's get to the root causes of it in the inner cities of this country.
The Anti-Defamation League tracked a 38% increase in white supremacist propaganda last year.
Who's tracking that?
The Anti-Defamation League.
Yeah, the ADL, I don't think is a particularly credible source when they have cherry-picked information. So who are we supposed to look to
when we're talking about this?
I would suggest look at there's a table, 2x2 table, federal law enforcement data, which you could say what you do. Maybe we shouldn't believe that either. But look at black on Asian crime, black on black crime,
the FBI hate crime statistics. That's a law enforcement agency. 59.1% was based on race, ethnicity, and ancestry, saying hate crimes rose 12% between 2020 and 2021.
Look at the absolute crimes themselves. What they classify as a hate crime is itself a political judgment. I think that when you actually care about protecting life, if you want to say Black Lives Matter, let's look at where Black lives are actually being lost. It's in the cities, at the heart of other Black Americans and criminals that are restrained by the absence
that we talk about as well. But are we supposed to ignore white supremacist hate crimes?
We're not supposed to ignore any kind of crime, Dasha. That's what I say. But what I see is a selective reporting. Take the Nashville Transgender Shooter Manifesto. Every shooter manifesto in a mass shooting has been released within 48 hours, except for that one shooter in Nashville. Now, it ended up being leaked. What do you see? It wasn't a white supremacist. It was somebody that was actually making fun of using derogatory terms. I believe.
Okay, so why are you okay talking about that manifesto and not talking about the manifesto from the 2015?
I'm more than okay talking about both, but what I'm asking is, why is the mainstream media suppress that one? Why did the police suppress that one?
Ramaswamy was also asked about some of the more bizarre conspiracy theories that have become a hallmark of his campaign in Iowa.
In recent weeks, you've put a lot of ideas out there. You've suggested on the campaign trail that January 6th was an inside job, that the plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer was a job of inside entrapment, that the House Republicans... Let me finish. That the House Republicans' impeachment inquiry is part of a Democratic plot to sideline Biden, that there is a devious Democratic scheme to actually nominate Nikki Haley. The reality is none of these are top issues for Iowa voters. So why are you focused on these conspiracy theories?
Well, focused is a heavy-handed word, Dasha. If you take 80% of what I said, I'm talking about policy and future direction of the country, talking about how we'll increase the supply of energy to bring down the cost for everyday Americans. And so that's 80% of what I'm talking about, but I'm not going to hide from what I do believe are realities hiding in plain sight that people deserve to know about. I'm sharing my true convictions, and I think if we want to revive our constitutional republic, we deserve a government that tells the people the truth again. Not just when it's easy, but when it is hard.
So if it's not a priority for voters, why are you so focused on it?
Because truth is a priority for me. That's the answer. Truth is the priority for this campaign.
And joining me now from Iowa is NBC's Dasha Burns. Dasha, wow. The first of your 3 interviews was full of news, so there's a lot to unpack there. Let's start with that exchange about white supremacy. Bottom line, how does Vivek Ramaswamy define white supremacy?
Well, it's a great question, Gabe. I mean, he asked me to define it. He asked the mainstream media to define it. With Ramaswamy, it's often less about how he defines things and more about his approach to dismantling definitions or criticizing what he believes to be how people have decided to define certain terms. That you heard me there press him on what I've often found in my conversations with him as to be straw man arguments that he'll put up in order to, bash them down. And listen, for me, Ramaswamy has been a relevant candidate, not so much because of where he's at in polling, right? He's polling in single digits, but more about what he represents within the GOP, within our politics today, because of some of what he spouts here. And he does draw these large crowds here in Iowa. He gets standing ovations when he speaks and uses the rhetoric like some of what you heard right there. And so I think it is important to pay attention to this, because we've ignored things like this in the past and have come to regret ignoring it and not taking this head on. And so I do think it's important to have these conversations and to push back and to hold accountable candidates that say things like this.
And, Dasha, when I was in Iowa last year, I spoke with several people that were considering Ramaswamy, even though they said they would eventually vote for Donald Trump. Now, he, of course, Ramaswamy is openly a Trump supporter, but he's running against him. He's trying to make this argument that, yes, Donald Trump was the best president ever, and yet somehow he would be a better president. So how did he answer the question of why Trump voters should back him and not the former president?
Well, he's actually taken an interesting turn when it comes to how he talks about the former president. He started to articulate kind of another theory around this rigged system that he believes is going to prevent former President Trump from ultimately winning the election in November. And he says that he believes he would be the better candidate that can actually take the party forward. Take a listen.
A lot of our base, myself included, loves the man because he got this fight started. But I think now it's our job to finish it. And I think I'm the person in this race who can take our America First agenda to the next level. do it by bringing in young people and others into our movement that haven't been part of the Republican Party or even the America First movement. That's my job, to take what Donald Trump started, but to take this to the next level, go far further on many policies than he did, but also unite this country in the process. And yes, to do it as a candidate who has not yet been wounded in the war they've waged on him. So both on policy and my ability to execute, my ability to bring younger people into this movement, but also perhaps most relevant this year, my ability to get to the finish line. It's my obligation to make sure we stay in this race through the end. And I expect that I will be the next president of the United States. I don't expect that the task of uniting and leading this country is going to be an easy one. I think it's going to take a leader with a lot of attributes, but that's why I'm in this.
But why wouldn't that same rigged system, if you're going even further than Donald Trump, why wouldn't it work against you too? Well,
look, they don't have on me what they have on him. You can just look right now. They've got 4 different wars they've waged on this man. At the end of the day, if we need a commander-in-chief who's going to lead us to victory, I think that our base needs to choose the general who is not yet wounded in that war.
Right,
That's
and you've said
and
this.
I'm going to say one more thing, Dash, about this. This is important. I think it takes 2 things to actually get this right. One is an outsider who can break the system when necessary. I bring that. Trump brings that too. But it also takes an outsider who knows and deeply understands the law and the Constitution of this country. I think in many ways, this managerial class in the swamp, they duped Donald Trump. They told him you couldn't fire 75% of those federal bureaucrats because of civil service protections. That's not true. You absolutely can in the context of a mass firing. Same thing from ending birthright citizenship to using our military to actually use even local law enforcement for mass deportations out of this country. They duped Trump in a way that they won't be duping me.
And Ramaswamy still maintains that there will be a shock and an upset here in Iowa on January 15th, Gabe.
Dasha Burns, live for us in Iowa. Dasha, thank you so much for that interview. And we'll see you tomorrow for your interview with Governor Ron DeSantis. As we mentioned, you can catch more of NBC and the Des Moines Register's closing arguments interviews all week long across our platforms, online, on air, and in print. Up next, new Trump endorsements, new developments on the campaign trail, and new charges for embattled Senator Bob Menendez. It's a busy day in politics. The panel's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. And welcome back. We're just 12 days out from the Iowa Republican caucus, and there's plenty of politics to dig into, so let's get right to our panel here. Joining me now on set is Idrees Kahloon, Washington Bureau Chief for The Economist, María Teresa Kumar, President and CEO of Voto Latino and an NBC News political analyst, and Sara Fagen, former White House political director under President George W. Bush. Thank you all so much for joining us here on Meet the Press Now. And Idrees, I want to start with you. We just played a large chunk of our interview with Vivek Ramaswamy. A lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
What stuck out to you?
Well, he's the same. He's combative. He's hyper-intelligent, hyper-fluent, but he's dipped in the polls, right? Mm-hmm. And you see that he has carved out this role for himself as a defender of Donald Trump, both and an antagonist of the media. He says that he's not going to run in any of the states that have removed Trump from the ballot. He seems at this point, and Dasha mentioned his poll numbers, you know, in the single digits in Iowa. It seems like he's staying in the race not to be president, although he says that's what he wants to be, but perhaps that he's auditioning to be vice president for Donald Trump.
So he might not be heading to the nomination, at least according to those polls, but is this where the party is heading?
This is the direction of travel from the party. I mean, Sara, you worked in the Bush White House, right? You know, how different are these Republicans from what you see now? But he has energy. He has people who come to his rallies and people who maybe are going to vote for Trump over him. But that is where the party is headed. It is this style of rhetoric. And Sara, I want to ask you that question. Is this where the party is heading? You, of course, work for former President George W. Bush. Is this where the party is heading?
Well, I think certainly a segment of the party has been heading that way and is heading more strongly. And you see Vivek, he captures some of the kind of intellectual Silicon Valley right who are fans of him, as well as a lot of younger kind of Republican men. And it's an interesting coalition that sort of he crafts with that style. And a lot of that is style. That is intentional. That combative approach is intentional because it speaks to a rigged system, which is what they believe.
And what'd you make of his comment that Donald Trump was wounded? That was perhaps one of the only criticisms that we've heard him level against the former president. What'd you make of that?
Well, he's got to do something to try to peel off some of that Trump support. And, you know, that's the theory that says we like him, we think he was a good president, but he just has too much noise around him. And so it's time for somebody who doesn't have that noise surrounding their candidacy. I think that's a weak argument. It's not going to pull anyone off of Donald Trump.
All right, I want to switch to María, Teresa, Kumar. It's looking quite likely, of course, that Donald Trump is going to run away with the win in Iowa. But I want to play you something that Ron DeSantis said yesterday about exceeding expectations, about the expectations game. Let's take a listen.
Do you think Iowa, for you, is it your deciding factor?
No, this is a race to get the majority of the delegates. You know, we've done Iowa the way people who have done well in Iowa have done, which is be on the ground, create the organization. The polling has never predicted how the results come out because it's a caucus and it's just a different beast.
María, what a difference a few months makes. You know, just a few months ago, I was talking to sources within the DeSantis campaign, basically saying that Iowa was everything, that they were putting all their eggs in the Iowa basket. And now, you know, he's walking away from that. What do you make of that argument? If not Iowa for Ron DeSantis, what?
Well, this is a candidate that was absolutely the one that was going to take Donald Trump down. He was Donald Trump light. And then he had to relaunch a campaign that folks felt that he never launched. He's lost his fizz. And as a result, I think the Republicans are now trying to coalesce around Nikki Haley. It's one of the reasons why we saw Vivek try to say, no, I'm actually the new Donald Trump. In fact, I agree with you. I think he's trying to run for vice president. And he's trying to be the foil, saying we are not white nationalists, when, in fact, everything that the former president, twice impeached, has demonstrated that he does embrace it. And so I think for DeSantis is that his campaign turned out to be dead on arrival, even though he had the largest purse of donations outside of Donald Trump. And I find that really quite surprising because he wasn't able to demonstrate what would make him different.
And Idrees, I want to turn to you on that point. On the point of the expectations game, what does a successful Iowa caucus look like for non-Trump candidates, whether it be DeSantis, whether it be Nikki Haley? How can they come out of there claiming some sort of victory? What threshold do they need to meet?
Look, the polls at the moment suggest that Donald Trump could get as much as 50% of Iowa. I think that if they manage to hold him to something less than that, that's some amount of encouragement. DeSantis, as you point out, has staked a lot on Iowa. He's done the full Grassley. He's gone all 99 counties. You know. And
the endorsement of the governor.
And the endorsement of the governor. And in New Hampshire, the governor there has endorsed Nikki Haley, who's been all of her campaign on that state as well. I think that you'll see, you know, likeliest Donald Trump runs away with both of those states. And at that point, the campaign is effectively done.
But is a second place in Iowa a moral victory? I mean, what does this signify? If Nikki Haley reaches a certain threshold and perhaps keeps Donald Trump under 50%, does she have a lot of juice heading into New Hampshire?
You know, you have some momentum effect, but, you know, if you end up consolidating, Trump against any single person head-to-head, still, according to the polls, suggests that Trump walks away with that. And losing by 30 as opposed to, you know, coming in the single digits, it's small consolation, but you still don't get to be president.
Whatever you can get. All right, Sara, I want to turn to you. Donald Trump locked up endorsements from the rest of House leadership today with the backing of Tom Emmer. I want to read from his statement. He said that Democrats have made clear that they will use every tool in their arsenal to try and keep Joe Biden and his failed policies in power, and we cannot let them. It's time for Republicans to unite behind our party's clear frontrunner, which is why I am proud to endorse Donald J. Trump for president. Still, not the biggest endorsement, of course. Emmer has a history with Donald Trump. What do you make of that endorsement?
I make that Tom Emmer hasn't given up on being Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Yes.
I mean, you know,
is it an acknowledgement of reality?
It's an acknowledgement of reality, which is that it'd be very difficult to lead a party organization, be in a party leadership position or the top position, and not have the support of the former president. Whether he wins the nomination or not, he's still going to be a major figure in the party. And
exactly to that point, does this show really the power that Donald Trump has over the Republican Party in Congress right now?
Well, he's the former president, so he is the most senior Republican, most recent elected person. So yes, definitionally, he has a lot of power on the party, and he is, as we've talked about, well ahead in the polls and likely to be the nominee based on what we know today. So yes, he has a lot of power over the party.
But I would actually kind of argue that Donald Trump, for all intents and purposes, is also an incumbent president. And the fact that he is not sweeping the Republican nomination also speaks to this vacuum. Well, he's not yet, right? Like he's
pretty far ahead.
No, he's far ahead, but it's part of because people haven't consolidated. I think if there was a candidate that folks were able to consolidate it against, I think that he should be polling. I mean, everybody talks about how low Biden is, but Donald Trump is not exactly that far ahead either.
I don't know if I buy that. His poll numbers are pretty high, but you're right. If there was some consolidation, but that has not happened yet. I do want to turn quickly, though, as we begin to run out of time here. I want to turn to the Democratic side. We just learned that President Biden will be giving a speech on Saturday near Valley Forge, and he's expected to talk about threats to democracy. It's a theme that his campaign is really leaning into right here. Is that straight from the 2020 playbook, and is that really the best option right now for the Biden-Harris campaign to attract these Democratic voters?
I think that he needs to continue sounding the alarm of that the person that is leading right now the Republican Party does not believe in the Republic. And by reminding the American people of that, it was one of the reasons why the red wave never came to fruition. You had plenty of Republicans and independent men who had voted historically Republican that decided either to stand it out or vote Democratic on the Democratic side in the midterms, because they recognize that we are living under, I hate to say this, I'm the optimist in the room, mostly existential threat. It is real. And so I think what he's trying to use this as a moment of saying, look, we have to stay the course. And this idea that the Biden administration hasn't done anything for the American people is pretty bogus. I think what we're going to be able to see in the next 15 years from now, what we're going to say is...
Will that message about threats to democracy, will it resonate?
I think it has. No, but it has. I mean, I think it has. That's one of the reasons why you saw so many... And it was so connected to how they gutted Roe versus Wade. That was the beginning of the erosion of not only democracy, but our rights. And it's one of the reasons why you had so many, again, independent Republican men say, you know what, I can't do this to the country. Do I love Joe Biden? No. But do I believe in democracy and our institutions? Absolutely.
Sarah, I want to give you one quick point, and then I want to end with Idrees.
I think it's certainly a great message for the Democratic base. I don't think it riles up other members. And to your point about the Biden accomplishments, if Biden was trying to appeal to independents, he should be talking about his accomplishments, but he's not. He's talking about this instead. And I think that tells
you... It's an anniversary.
I think that this tells you a lot about what he's going to campaign on and what he's not going to campaign on.
And Idrees, finally, really quickly, President Biden also giving a speech in Charleston, South Carolina on Monday. Is that part of the effort by the Biden-Harris campaign to attract and to retain black voters?
Well, they were asked about this, and they said, no, it's about, the soul of the nation, all these other themes that they're trying to sound. But, I think that most voters have heard of January 6th. They know about the trials, and yet, in the polls, Donald Trump is leading Biden by a few points. So, the democracy versus autocracy point is an effective one for the base, but I don't think that it might have the pull that the campaign thinks that it does.
Idrees, María, Teresa, and Sara, thank you all so much for joining us here on the panel on Meet the Press Now. And after the break, the increasingly volatile situation in the Middle East. We're live in Tehran with everything we know and don't know about those deadly blasts in Iran that killed nearly 100 people and wounded countless others. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Turning now to Iran and an increasingly volatile situation across the Middle East. State media reports that 95 people have been killed and more than 100 injured in a pair of blasts in Iran, in what Iranian officials are calling a terror attack. State television showed people running after two explosions hit the southeastern city of Kerman at an event marking the death of Iran's top general, Soleimani, who was killed in a U.S. drone strike 4 years ago. This afternoon, the U.S. saying it was not behind the blast, and there was no reason to believe Israel was behind them either, but that it was too early to say what might have caused the explosions. NBC's Ali Arouzi joins us now from Tehran. And Ali, what more do we know about these explosions, and how are Iranian leaders responding?
Hey, Gabe. Well, as you mentioned in the intro, the death toll has been revised. Initially, they were saying 103. Now it's gone down to 95 because they said some names were duplicated. The casualties still remain at over 210, and whether the death toll is 95 or 103, it still marks the worst terrorist attack in the Islamic Republic's 45-year history. And as you mentioned, they were twin bombs that went off about 10 or 15 minutes apart from each other near a cemetery where a ceremony was being held to mark the death of Qasem Soleimani, who was taken out by a drone strike in 2020 by the US. Now, state television reported a blast first and then a second explosion during the ceremony in Kerman. Apparently, the first blast struck about 2,300 feet away from Soleimani's grave, so it was very close. What we understand is that people that were around the grave were government and military officials, and the blast happened outside in the street, so most of the people that were injured or killed were civilians, amongst them women and children. And unsurprisingly, Gabe, the Iranians are pointing the finger squarely at Israel. A senior member of Iran's parliament almost immediately after the blast said that he's waiting for more information, but this bears all the hallmarks of a Mossad attack. The former head of the IRGC reiterated those comments, saying that this will spell the end of Israel. And then Iran's president came out and made a speech saying that this was the work of Israeli and American operatives in this country, and they should anticipate very strong revenge from the country. With all of that said, Gabe, the Israelis have conducted many attacks in Iran over the decades, but they've been very targeted. They've hit nuclear scientists or senior military figures. They've never done a mass casualty attack, so this wouldn't be part of their MO. Nonetheless, it's going to be a critical 24, 48 hours to see if Iran delivers on its threats.
Ali Arouzi, live for us in Tehran. Ali, thank you so much. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, fallout continues from a strike in Beirut that killed a top Hamas leader, amid concerns that Israel's war with Hamas could expand into a broader regional conflict. Today, U.S. officials telling NBC News Israel did not notify the U.S. in advance of the strike, but did tell Washington once it was underway. Israel has not yet publicly taken responsibility for the strike, but this afternoon, the White House said Israel has a right to go after the threat of Hamas, including its leadership.
Israel, as I've said before, has a right and responsibility to go after the threat that Hamas poses, which means they have a right and responsibility to go after the leadership of Hamas. Now, as I've also said many, many times from the podium, we expect that they'll do that in accordance with international law.
And joining me now is NBC global security expert and reporter Dan DeLuce. And Dan, the U.S. is saying it was not given a heads up about that strike in Lebanon. What obligation would Israel have to tell the U.S.? And then also, why hasn't Israel claimed responsibility for this yet?
You know, Gabe, Israel technically doesn't have an obligation. It's a sovereign country. And of course, as you know, they have a long history of going after their enemies, hunting them down abroad, and these very precise sort of assassinations that looks like this is another example of it. Now, of course, the U.S., I think, would like to have a heads up.
Given all the assistance that it is giving Israel and the relationship they have, right?
That's right. The U.S. is giving them massive billions of dollars worth of military assistance every year, and now it's very much needed by Israel, and they're asking for more. And, of course, also the U.S. has concerns about this threat of a regional war, a wider conflict that could draw to.
And on that point, we also heard Kirby address the Iran explosions today. So how is the U.S. approaching possible escalation there?
So those explosions in Iran, I think from the White House's point of view, are not hopefully going to trigger the regional war that they fear. But you did hear Ali talking about how the regime in Tehran is blaming Israel already for that, even though it bears none of the hallmarks of an Israeli intelligence operation that we've seen in the past. That kind of a massive terrorist attack is not what Israel would usually be associated with, and the U.S. is saying it wasn't them. But yes, the U.S. is now looking at trying to create more ceasefires or pauses that would de-escalate the situation. And of course, they want to see Israel scale back the scale of their operations.
Well, with regarding the Lebanon strike, what do we think that means for hostage negotiations here?
I don't think it's going to help the hostage negotiations, clearly. And I think Israel made a calculation that it was worth the risk of retaliation by Hezbollah in Lebanon, or even possibly jeopardizing those negotiations because they felt this commander was so important and so senior they wanted to take him out.
Right, and again, Israel has not yet taken responsibility officially for that strike, but the U.S. does believe that they did carry out that strike. Dan DeLuce, thank you so much for joining us here on Meet the Press Now. And still to come, under threat, state capitals in more than half a dozen states were evacuated today due to security concerns and bomb threats. The very latest is next. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Meet the Press Now.
And there's actually two different things going on here. One, hoax bomb threats have become a real problem in this country, with some of them coming from overseas. A few weeks ago, dozens of threats were sent to schools and religious institutions in Oregon, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah. And then the second thing is, though, as you said, threats to public officials and election workers have skyrocketed in recent years. And just looking at federal arrests for threats to public officials, there were 38 in 2013 and 74 last year. And that's just a small subset. The good news is that making a hoax bomb threat and threatening public officials, those are federal crimes, and people do get caught and prosecuted for doing it, and the FBI is trying to find those people.
And again, do we know the details about were these threats called in today, or any more details that you can share with us?
What they're saying is that this was an email. This was a mass email to a number of different places.
And the penalties regarding these types, you mentioned that there have been an increased arrests over the last couple of years, but what are some of the penalties here for these felonies?
Yeah, they can carry prison time. These are serious crimes, making an interstate threat, calling in a hoax bomb threat, because they have real repercussions, Gabe.
All right, and Ken, we're also, this also comes just weeks after, somebody was found just outside the Capitol with a weapon on them. Unclear if they were actually threatening members of Congress. But how closely is law enforcement looking into this here in Washington, D.C.?
Well, again, I would separate this phenomenon of hoax bomb threats, which is increasing but has been with us for a long time, and these specific threats to public officials. It may be a related phenomenon, but it's two different threat streams. And really the more concerning one is the threats to public officials, because that has been a real thing. And people have actually attacked public officials, including most famously the husband of the Speaker of the House, Paul Pelosi, attacked in his home. And there have been many more threats, horrific threats made to public officials, including to the judge presiding over former President Trump's trial on election suppression charges. So the FBI has said this is a major priority for them. They are trying to investigate these cases, and they are encouraging state and local law enforcement to take this very, very seriously, Gabe.
Ken Delanian, our justice correspondent. Ken, thanks so much. And turning now to Texas and the fight over abortion rights. A federal appeals court has ruled Texas can ban emergency abortions, affirming a district court's ruling that sided with Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. Paxton had sued to block 2022 guidance from the Department of Health and Human Services that a federal law governing emergency rooms can require abortion when necessary, even in states where it's banned. The ruling comes after the Texas Supreme Court denied a request for an emergency court order to allow Kate Cox, a pregnant woman whose fetus had a fatal diagnosis, to have an abortion in the state. The issue of abortion is set to play a major role during the 2024 election cycle, after being a driving force behind Democratic success in the 2022 midterms. And thank you so much for being with us this hour. I'm Gabe Gutierrez. Kristen is back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. And we'll be back with more of our closing arguments, Iowa series, featuring our exclusive interview with Governor Ron DeSantis, 12 days out from the Iowa caucuses. NBC News Now coverage continues now with Hallie Jackson.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app, or follow us on social media.